Sarah Mitchell had grown, used to being invisible. At every military gathering, every barbecue, every coffee morning with the other wives, she was simply Jake's wife. The woman who smiled politely, brought homemade cookies, and listened to stories about deployments with the patient expression of someone who understood the weight of waiting. She stood at the kitchen window of their base housing unit, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground. Her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, steam rising from her coffee like the memories she kept buried deep inside. Jake had left 3 hours ago for another training exercise, his kiss still warm on her cheek, his promise to be home by dinner another thread in the fabric of their military life. The other wives saw her as lucky. Sarah Mitchell had married Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, one of the most decorated Navy SEALs on the base. He was handsome, successful, and completely devoted to her. What they didn't know was that Sarah had once been someone entirely different, someone whose hands had held more than coffee cups, and whose eyes had seen through scopes that could reach across impossible distances. Before she became Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah had been Sergeant Sarah Chun, one of the most skilled snipers the Army had ever trained. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, each deployment adding another layer to the wall she had built around those memories. Her record was flawless, her shots legendary among those who knew, but that life felt like it belonged to someone else now. She had met Jake during her final deployment. He was running a joint operation, and she was providing overwatch for his team. She remembered the moment their eyes met after the mission, both of them dusty and exhausted but alive. He had looked at her not as a weapon or a tool, but as a woman. It was the first time in years someone had seen her as more than her rifle. When they returned stateside, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She left the military. Jake had never asked her to, had never even hinted that she should, but she was tired of carrying the weight of every shot, every life that had ended at the squeeze of her trigger. She wanted to be someone's wife, someone's partner, someone who could sleep through the night without checking windows and calculating angles. The transition wasn't easy. For months, she found herself reaching for weapons that weren't there, scanning rooftops out of habit, feeling naked without her rifle. But Jake was patient, understanding in ways that only another soldier could be. He held her through the nightmares and never asked questions about the scars that mapped her body like a history of violence. Now, 2 years later, she had almost convinced herself she had succeeded in becoming the person she wanted to be. Almost. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Janet Morrison, the commanding officer's wife and the unofficial leader of the wives group. Janet's voice was bright and cheerful, as always, inviting Sarah to lunch at the officers' club. Sarah accepted, as she always did, playing her part in the careful social hierarchy of military spouses. An hour later, she sat at a round table with 5 other women, listening to them discuss everything from school fundraisers to deployment schedules. Sarah nodded at appropriate moments, laughed at the right jokes, and contributed just enough to avoid seeming antisocial. But part of her mind was elsewhere, observing the room with the tactical awareness she couldn't quite shake. She noticed the new security measures that had been quietly implemented over the past month. Additional guards at the main gate, subtle changes in patrol patterns, the way conversations stopped when certain topics came up. Something was happening, something the wives weren't being told about, but Sarah's trained eye caught the signs. "Sarah, you're so quiet today," Janet said, pulling her back to the conversation. "Everything okay at home?" "Of course," Sarah replied with the practiced smile she had perfected. "Just thinking about what to make for dinner." The other women laughed, and the conversation moved on to recipes and meal planning. But Sarah caught the look that passed between Janet and Colonel Thompson's wife, Margaret. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it spoke of shared knowledge and careful secrets. That evening, Jake came home later than expected. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and there was a tension in his shoulders that Sarah recognized from their deployment days. He kissed her hello, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. "Rough day," she asked, handing him a beer as he sank into his favorite chair. Just training, he replied automatically, but Sarah knew better. She had been a soldier long enough to recognize the difference between training stress and operational stress. Jake was carrying something heavier than practice scenarios. They ate dinner in comfortable silence, but Sarah watched her husband carefully. She noticed how he checked his phone more frequently than usual, how his eyes kept drifting to the windows, how he seemed to be listening for something beyond their conversation. When they went to bed, he held her a little tighter than normal, and she felt him lie awake long after she had pretended to fall asleep. The next morning brought news that sent ripples of anxiety through the base community. A family from the nearby town had gone missing while hiking in the mountains that bordered the installation. Search and rescue teams had been deployed, and the local sheriff's department was working with base security to coordinate efforts. Sarah learned about it at the commissary, where the wives gathered information like intelligence analysts. The missing family had been camping in an area that was technically off-limits, but not well-marked. Their car had been found abandoned at a trailhead, with no sign of struggle, but also no indication of where they might have gone. "It's probably nothing," Janet said, but her voice carried an uncertainty that Sarah had never heard before. People get lost in those mountains all the time. But Sarah knew it wasn't nothing. She could see it in the increased security presence, in the way the MPs looked a little more alert, in the subtle changes to base protocol that most people wouldn't notice. Something was wrong, and the missing family was either part of it or a tragic coincidence. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised her. She drove to the base library and requested access to local topographical maps. The librarian, a retired Air Force sergeant, gave her a curious look but provided what she asked for. Sarah spread the maps across a table and began studying the terrain around the base. Her sniper training kicked in automatically. She found herself analyzing sight lines, identifying potential observation posts, calculating distances and angles. The mountains that bordered the base offered numerous vantage points that could compromise base security. If someone wanted to conduct surveillance or plan an attack, those peaks would be perfect. She traced possible routes with her finger, marking areas where a small team could establish a hide and remain undetected for days. The missing family's campsite was located near one such area, a rocky outcrop that would provide excellent overwatch of the base's main facilities. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as the tactical picture became clear. This wasn't about a lost family. This was about positioning and reconnaissance. Someone was watching the base, and they had either taken the family or caused them to disappear to avoid exposure. She gathered the maps and returned them to the librarian, her mind racing with possibilities. Should she share her suspicions with Jake? With base security? But what if she was wrong? What if 2 years of civilian life had made her paranoid, seeing threats where none existed? That evening, she tried to act normal, but Jake noticed her distraction immediately. He had always been able to read her, even when she thought she was hiding her thoughts perfectly. "What's on your mind?" he asked as they cleaned up after dinner. Sarah hesitated. She had worked so hard to leave her military identity behind, to become the wife Jake deserved rather than the soldier she had been. But the situation was escalating, and her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. "The missing family," she said finally. "I've been thinking about where they disappeared." Jake's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Sarah, that's not something you need to worry about. Search and rescue will find them." "What if they don't?" she pressed. "What if this isn't about a lost family?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake studied her face, and she could see him recognizing something in her expression, something he hadn't seen since their deployment days. The soldier was emerging from behind the wife's careful facade. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she was stepping across a threshold she had sworn never to cross again. "I think someone is using those mountains to watch the base. I think the family stumbled onto something they shouldn't have seen." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. When he spoke again, His voice carried a weight that confirmed her worst fears. "Sarah, I need you to stay away from this. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you might want to do, I need you to promise me you'll stay out of it." But even as she nodded, even as she gave him the reassurance he needed to hear, Sarah knew it was already too late. The soldier inside her was awake, and she couldn't make herself go back to being just a Navy SEAL's wife. Not when every instinct she possessed was telling her that danger was coming, and she might be the only one positioned to see it clearly. That night, she lay awake listening to Jake's breathing and staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she decided she would take a drive through the mountains. Just to clear her head, she would tell herself, just to see the autumn leaves. But in her heart, she knew she was going hunting. The next morning dawned crisp and clear with the kind of mountain air that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Sarah packed a small backpack with water, energy bars, and her old field binoculars, the only piece of equipment she had kept from her military days. To anyone watching, she was simply taking a nature hike, getting some fresh air while her husband was at work. She drove her small SUV up the winding mountain road, past the point where search and rescue vehicles had established their command post. The activity there had increased since yesterday, with more personnel and equipment arriving hourly. She could see the tension in their movements, the urgency that spoke of a situation spiraling beyond a simple missing persons case. Sarah parked at a trailhead about 3 miles from where the family's car had been found. She had chosen this location carefully, knowing it would give her access to the ridge line without crossing directly through the active search area. As she shouldered her pack and began hiking, she felt her body remembering movements and rhythms she had thought forgotten. The forest was alive with autumn colors, but Sarah's eyes were trained on the terrain itself. She noted possible ambush points, areas where tracks would be visible, places where someone could cache supplies or equipment. Her pace was steady, but unhurried, giving her time to observe and analyze everything around her. After an hour of climbing, she reached a rocky overlook that provided an excellent view of the base below. Through her binoculars, she could see the main buildings, the airfield, and the residential areas where military families live their daily lives. It was exactly the kind of position she would have chosen for long-term surveillance. Sarah spent several minutes studying the surrounding area, looking for any signs of recent human activity. She found them almost immediately: scuff marks on rocks, disturbed soil patterns, and the faint outline of what might have been a temporary shelter. Someone had been here recently, and they had taken care to minimize their footprint, but hadn't been perfect about it. She photographed everything with her phone, documenting the evidence with the same methodical approach she had once used for intelligence gathering. Then, she moved on, following the ridge line toward the area where the family had disappeared. The terrain grew more challenging as she progressed, requiring careful navigation around steep drops and rocky outcrops. But Sarah's conditioning from her military days served her well, and she made steady progress. As she climbed higher, the view of the base became even more comprehensive, confirming her suspicion that this entire ridge line was a surveillance goldmine. 2 hours into her hike, she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden among a cluster of large boulders was what remained of a campsite, but not the kind used by recreational hikers. This was a professional hide, constructed with military precision and designed to be invisible from both ground level and aerial observation. The camp had been hastily abandoned, but Sarah could read the story it told. Multiple people had been here for several days, possibly a week or more. They had sophisticated equipment, based on the mounting points carved into the rock and the cable management systems still partially in place. This was a surveillance operation, and a highly professional one. Sarah's heart raced as she documented the site. She found empty MRE packages buried in a waste pit, evidence of night vision equipment use, and, most disturbing of all, brass casings from high-powered rifles. Whatever this group had been planning, they were prepared for violence. As she photographed the last of the evidence, Sarah heard voices echoing from the valley below. She froze, listening carefully to determine their location and direction. The voices were speaking in English, but with an accent she couldn't immediately place. They seemed to be moving along the trail she had used earlier. Sarah quickly gathered her equipment and moved to a concealed position among the boulders. Through her binoculars, she could see 3 men making their way up the trail. They were dressed like hikers, but their movements and the way they carried themselves screamed military training. These were not tourists who had wandered off the beaten path. The men were armed, though they had made an effort to conceal their weapons. Sarah could see the outline of pistols beneath their jackets and what appeared to be compact assault rifles in their day packs. They moved with the coordinated precision of a trained unit, communicating through hand signals and maintaining tactical spacing. Sarah's mind raced as she processed what she was seeing. This confirmed her worst fears. There was an active threat in these mountains, and it was directly related to the base below. The missing family had probably stumbled onto this surveillance operation and had either been taken or forced to flee. She needed to get this information to base security immediately, but first she had to get off the mountain without being detected. The 3 men were between her and the trail back to her vehicle, which meant she would have to find another route down. Sarah studied her topographical memory of the area, plotting a course that would take her around the men's position and back to civilization. It would be longer and more difficult, but it was her only option if she wanted to avoid confrontation. She was unarmed and alone, facing what appeared to be a professional hostile force. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah began her descent through a steep ravine that paralleled the main trail. The going was treacherous with loose rock and hidden obstacles, but her training kicked in automatically. She placed each step carefully, testing her weight before committing, moving from cover to cover like the ghost she had once been. Halfway down the ravine, she heard the distinctive crack of breaking branches above her. Someone was following her route, moving fast and not particularly concerned about noise discipline. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized she had been spotted. She abandoned stealth for speed, half running and half sliding down the rocky slope. Behind her, she could hear her pursuers crashing through the underbrush, their voices calling to each other in urgent tones. Whatever their original mission had been, she had now become their priority target. Sarah's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder than she had in years. The civilian life had softened her, but muscle memory and adrenaline carried her forward. She could hear her pursuers getting closer, their heavy breathing and cursing echoing off the rock walls of the ravine. At the bottom of the ravine, Sarah faced a choice. The direct route to her vehicle would take her across open ground where she could be easily seen and targeted. The alternative was to follow a creek bed that would provide cover but would take much longer and might lead her away from safety. The sound of a rifle bolt being worked made the decision for her. Someone was very close enough to take a shot if she showed herself in the open. Sarah plunged into the creek bed, the cold mountain water soaking through her boots as she splashed downstream. The creek twisted and turned through the forest, sometimes running deep enough to provide complete concealment, other times barely covering the rocky bottom. Sarah stayed low, moving as fast as the terrain would allow, her phone held high to keep it dry. She could hear her pursuers spreading out, trying to cut off her escape routes. Their voices carried occasional words in English, mixed with what sounded like Russian or Eastern European language. This wasn't just a surveillance operation. This was foreign intelligence activity on American soil, directly targeting a critical military installation. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Sarah reached a point where the creek passed under a road. She could see her SUV parked about half a mile away, but the open ground between her and safety looked like a killing field. She needed a diversion, something to draw her pursuers' attention away from her escape route. Sarah looked around desperately for options. Near the road, she could see a small maintenance shed that probably contained road equipment. If she could create enough noise and confusion, she might be able to draw the hostile force away from her vehicle long enough to reach it. Taking a deep breath, Sarah sprinted from the creek bed toward the shed. Behind her, shouts erupted as her movement was detected. She could hear feet pounding on rock and earth as her pursuers converged on her position. The shed was locked, but Sarah's military training included creative problem-solving. She found a loose piece of rebar from a construction project and used it to pry open the door. Inside, she found what she was looking for, a gas-powered leaf blower and several cans of gasoline. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah doused a pile of old tarps and maintenance materials with gasoline. She started the leaf blower and positioned it to create maximum noise and chaos, then lit the improvised fire. Black smoke began pouring from the shed as alarms and sirens from nearby fire detection systems began wailing. The diversion worked perfectly. Sarah could hear her pursuers shouting in confusion as emergency vehicles began responding to the fire. In the chaos, she slipped out the back of the shed and sprinted toward her vehicle, staying low and using every piece of cover available. She reached her SUV just as the first fire truck arrived on scene. Without looking back, Sarah started the engine and drove away at normal speed, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to floor the accelerator. She needed to look like a concerned citizen, leaving the area due to the emergency, not a fleeing target. As she drove down the mountain, Sarah's hands shook with adrenaline and the magnitude of what she had discovered. The base was under active surveillance by what appeared to be a foreign intelligence operation. The missing family was probably dead or captured, and she might be the only person who knew the truth about what was happening in those mountains. Her phone had survived the creek crossing, and the photos she had taken were clear enough to provide solid evidence. But who could she trust with this information? Base security would want to know how a Navy SEAL's wife had come to possess classified-level intelligence about a hostile operation. Jake would be furious that she had put herself at risk, and there was always the possibility that the threat had already penetrated base security. Sarah made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her as the quiet, supportive military wife. She was going to handle this herself, at least until she could determine who could be trusted with the information. Her sniper training hadn't just taught her how to shoot, it had taught her how to think tactically, how to plan operations, and how to survive in hostile territory. The woman who had spent 2 years trying to forget how to be a soldier was about to remember why she had been one of the best. Sarah drove home in a controlled panic, her mind racing through tactical assessments and threat analyses. She had to assume her pursuers had gotten a good enough look at her to identify her later, which meant both she and Jake were now potential targets. But more immediately, she needed to figure out how to warn the base without exposing herself to questions she couldn't answer. Back at her house, Sarah locked the doors and closed the blinds, habits from her deployment days that felt natural now. She uploaded the photos from her phone to a secure cloud account Jake had set up for family pictures, then sat at her kitchen table to study them more carefully on her laptop. The evidence was even more damning when viewed in detail. The surveillance site had been professionally constructed with clear sight lines to critical base infrastructure. The abandoned equipment showed signs of sophisticated electronics. This wasn't some amateur operation. The brass casings she had photographed were from 7.62mm rifles, probably sniper weapons based on the precision of their placement. More troubling were the MRE packages she had found. They were standard U.S. military rations, but the lot numbers and dates suggested they were stolen rather than purchased legitimately. Someone with access to American military supplies was supporting this operation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." The message was routine, but something about the timing felt wrong. Jake never worked late without advance notice, especially during training periods. Sarah studied the text more carefully and noticed something that made her blood run cold. Jake always signed his messages with Zoxo, a silly habit that had developed during their deployment correspondence. This message was missing that signature. Either Jake was in trouble or someone else was using his phone. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her during crisis situations. Her civilian panic transformed into operational thinking, her mind automatically shifting into mission planning mode. She needed to assume that Jake was compromised and that hostile forces might now know about her discovery in the mountains. She moved through the house systematically, gathering items she might need while maintaining the appearance of normal evening activities. In their bedroom closet, behind Jake's dress uniforms, was a small lockbox containing her emergency cash and the one weapon she had kept from her military service, a compact pistol that Jake didn't know she still owned. Sarah checked the weapon automatically, her hands remembering the routine of inspection and preparation. 15 rounds in a standard magazine, one additional magazine, and a small cleaning kit. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Next, she needed intelligence. Sarah booted up Jake's personal laptop, using the password she had watched him type countless times. She felt guilty about violating his privacy, but the situation was beyond normal relationship boundaries. If Jake was in trouble, she needed to know everything she could about what was happening on the base. Jake's email contained nothing unusual. Routine military correspondence, social messages from friends, and civilian email about their household accounts. But when Sarah checked his browsing history, she found something interesting. He had been researching the missing family extensively, going far beyond what would be normal curiosity. He had looked up their backgrounds, their employment history, and their family connections. The missing father, David Chun, had worked as a defense contractor specializing in communication systems. His wife, Linda, was a former Army intelligence analyst who had left the service to raise their 2 children. This wasn't a random family. There were people with direct knowledge of military operations and classified information. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The family hadn't stumbled onto a surveillance operation by accident. They had been targeted, probably approached, or contacted by someone who knew their background and their potential value. Their hiking trip had been cover for something else, and that something had gone wrong. A sound from the front yard made Sarah freeze. Through a gap in the blinds, she could see a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine running. 2 figures sat in the front seats, and though she couldn't see their faces clearly, their posture suggested they were watching her house. Sarah moved to the back of the house and looked out through the kitchen window. Another vehicle, a SUV, was parked in the alley behind their yard. She was being watched, possibly surrounded, and Jake was somewhere beyond her reach. Her phone rang, and Jake's name appeared on the caller ID. Sarah hesitated before answering, knowing this could be a trap, but needing to know what was happening to her husband. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Sarah, thank God." Jake's voice was tight with stress. "Listen to me very carefully. I need you to pack a bag and leave the house immediately. Go to your sister's place in Colorado. Don't take your normal route, and don't tell anyone where you're going." "Jake, what's happening? Where are you?" "I can't explain right now, but the base is dealing with a serious security situation. Some of the wives are being moved to safe locations as a precaution. I'll contact you when it's safe." Sarah wanted to believe him, but something in his voice wasn't right. Jake was scared, which was unusual enough, but he was also being too vague about details. The Jake she knew would have given her specific instructions and timeline information, even in a crisis. "Jake, what's our code word?" she asked quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. During their deployment, they had established a duress code, a seemingly innocent phrase that would indicate one of them was in trouble and speaking under coercion. If this was really Jake calling freely, he would know to give her the phrase. "Sarah, I don't have time for games. Just get out of the house now." The lack of the code word told her everything she needed to know. Either Jake was compromised or someone else was using his phone. Either way, she was on her own. "Okay," she said, putting false compliance in her voice. "I'll pack right now and leave for my sister's place." "Good. I love you, Sarah. Everything's going to be okay." The line went dead, and Sarah immediately began implementing an escape plan she hoped she would never need to use. She had scouted emergency routes out of their neighborhood during her first week living there, a paranoid habit that Jake had teased her about, but that now might save her life. Sarah quickly changed into dark clothing and loaded her backpack with essentials, water, energy bars, first aid kit, extra ammunition, and cash. She left lights on throughout the house and set the television to a normal volume to maintain the illusion of normal evening activity. The basement had an old coal chute that opened into the backyard, hidden behind overgrown bushes. Sarah had checked its condition months ago and knew it was still functional. It would be a tight fit, but it would allow her to exit the house without being seen by her watchers. As she prepared to leave, Sarah made one final decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her as a quiet military wife. She was going to take the fight to the people who had threatened her family and her community. But first, she needed to get to the base and find out what had really happened to Jake. The coal chute was even tighter than she remembered, and Sarah had to force herself through the narrow opening, feeling like she was being reborn into a world where she was a soldier again rather than a wife. She emerged behind the bushes covered in dust and old coal residue, but completely concealed from the surveillance vehicles. Sarah moved through her neighbors' backyards like a ghost, using garden sheds and parked cars for cover. The skills came back automatically: how to move silently, how to use shadows, how to be invisible in plain sight. She had spent 2 years trying to forget these abilities, but now they felt as natural as breathing. 3 blocks from her house, she reached a 24-hour diner where she knew she could get a taxi without being tracked. The driver was an elderly man who didn't ask questions about her appearance or her destination. She gave him an address near the base, but not close enough to attract attention. During the ride, Sarah used her phone to access the base's public information systems. The official website mentioned a routine training exercise that was affecting base operations, but there was no mention of missing families or security threats. The sanitized language told her that something significant was being covered up. Sarah paid the taxi driver and walked the last mile to the base, approaching from an angle that would avoid the main checkpoints. She knew the base's security perimeter better than most civilians, having studied it during the early days of her marriage when everything about Jake's work environment had fascinated her. The base was clearly in a heightened state of alert. Sarah could see additional guard posts, increased patrols, and subtle changes to lighting and access controls. But she also noticed something else: gaps in the perimeter that existed because the base's security planners had assumed threats would come from outside, not from someone with inside knowledge. Getting onto the base without authorization was a serious federal crime, but Sarah was past worrying about legal consequences. The people who had Jake were planning something that would make her trespassing charge seem insignificant by comparison. She found the weak point she was looking for: a drainage culvert that passed under the base's perimeter fence. It would be unpleasant and possibly dangerous, but it would get her inside undetected. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, then crawled into the dark water that would carry her into the heart of the installation her husband had sworn to protect. As she emerged on the other side of the fence, Sarah felt the final transformation complete itself. The Navy SEAL's wife was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. The question now was whether she could become enough of a soldier again to save the man she loved and the base that had become their home. Inside the base perimeter, Sarah moved like a shadow through familiar territory that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. Every building, every pathway held potential threats now. The enhanced security she observed from outside was even more apparent up close. This wasn't a training exercise, it was a base under siege. She made her way toward the communications center, staying in the shadows and avoiding the patrol routes she had memorized from her months of base life. If Jake was being held, or if there had been a breach, the communication center would be either the target or the command post for response operations. As she approached the building, Sarah saw something that confirmed her worst fears. The center was surrounded by vehicles and personnel, but not in the pattern of a defensive response. This looked like an occupation force, with personnel who didn't move like American military. They were too relaxed, too confident, and their equipment was wrong for U.S. forces. Sarah found an observation position in a maintenance building that gave her a clear view of the communications center. Through her binoculars, she could see at least 12 hostiles holding the building. They had established professional defensive positions and were clearly comfortable with their situation. This wasn't a raid or a quick strike. This was a sustained operation. More troubling was what she could see through the windows of the center itself. Banks of communications equipment were being systematically accessed by personnel who clearly knew what they were looking for. This wasn't random terrorism or simple sabotage. Someone was stealing classified communications data, probably intercepting and copying everything that flowed through the base's networks. Movement near the building's rear entrance caught her attention. Two figures were being escorted between vehicles, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Even at distance, Sarah recognized one of them immediately. Jake, alive, but clearly a prisoner. The other figure was a woman she didn't recognize, probably base communications personnel who had been captured when the facility was taken. Sarah felt a surge of relief that Jake was alive, followed immediately by tactical analysis of the situation. The hostiles were using prisoners as leverage and human shields. Any rescue attempt would put Jake and others at extreme risk. But leaving them in hostile hands wasn't an option either, especially if the enemy was planning to extract them along with the stolen intelligence. She needed more information before she could plan any kind of intervention. Sarah moved to a different observation point, this one closer to the perimeter of the communications center. From here, she could see more details about the hostile force and their operations. The attackers were definitely foreign, probably Eastern European based on their equipment and the fragments of conversation she could overhear. They had body armor, assault rifles, and, most concerning, what appear to be demolition charges placed strategically around the building. They weren't just planning to steal information. They intended to destroy the evidence of their operation. Sarah's military mind automatically began calculating angles, distances, and tactical options. She was one person with limited ammunition against a professional force of at least 12, operating from prepared positions with hostages. By any rational analysis, this was an impossible situation. But Sarah had never been rational when it came to protecting the people she loved. She studied the hostile positions more carefully, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. The enemy had made one critical error in their positioning. They had assumed they were facing a conventional military response from outside the perimeter. Their defensive positions were oriented outward, leaving them vulnerable to attack from within the base. More importantly, they had positioned themselves in a way that gave Sarah access to elevated firing positions. The maintenance buildings and communications towers around the center provided multiple sniper hides that would allow her to engage targets without exposing herself to return fire. Sarah had to make a choice that went against everything she had tried to become over the past 2 years. She could find base security and report what she had seen, hoping they could mount an effective response before the hostiles completed their mission and potentially killed the hostages. Or she could take direct action herself, using skills she had promised herself never to use again. The decision was made for her when she saw the hostiles beginning to move equipment toward vehicles parked behind the communications center. They were preparing to extract, which meant Jake and the other prisoners would either be taken with them or eliminated as witnesses. Sarah couldn't wait for official response that might come too late. She needed a weapon more effective than her pistol. Sarah made her way to the base armory, a building she had visited once during a family day event. Security around the armory had been increased, but it was still designed to keep unauthorized personnel out, not to stop someone with her particular skill set. The side entrance to the armory had an electronic lock that Sarah couldn't bypass, but it also had an older mechanical backup system. Her lock-picking skills were rusty, but after several tense minutes, she managed to gain entry to the building. Inside, Sarah found exactly what she needed, an M24 sniper rifle with a high-powered scope, the same weapon system she had used during her deployments. She also took extra ammunition, a suppressor, and night vision equipment. For the first time in years, she felt completely equipped for the mission ahead. Getting the rifle out of the armory and into position required careful movement through areas with increased security patrols. But Sarah's knowledge of the base layout and her ability to move undetected allowed her to reach the maintenance building she had selected as her primary firing position. The building's roof provided an excellent view of the communication center at a range of approximately 300 meters, well within her effective engagement distance. Sarah set up the rifle with the mechanical precision she had learned through thousands of hours of training, adjusting for wind, elevation, and lighting conditions. Through the scope, she could see the hostile force more clearly than ever. They were definitely professional soldiers or intelligence operatives, probably Spetsnaz or similar special forces. Their leader was coordinating the final phases of their operation through a tactical radio, giving orders that Sarah wished she could understand. Jake and the other prisoner were still visible near the vehicles, now with additional guards watching them closely. Sarah could see that Jake was alert and looking for opportunities, but his hands were still secured and he was outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah began identifying her targets in order of priority. The leader first, then the demolitions specialist who was preparing charges to destroy the building, then the guards closest to the prisoners. She would have perhaps 30 seconds from her first shot before the entire force reacted and took cover. This was the moment Sarah had hoped never to face again. The moment when she would have to take human lives to protect others. Her hands were steady on the rifle, but her heart was pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. For 2 years, she had tried to forget what it felt like to be a weapon, but now she needed to remember every lesson that had made her deadly. The first shot took the hostile leader in the chest, dropping him instantly. Before his body hit the ground, Sarah had acquired her second target and fired again. The demolitions specialist fell backward over his explosive charges, his detonator spinning away into the darkness. Chaos erupted around the communications center as the remaining hostiles tried to locate the source of the attack. Sarah continued engaging targets with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and instantly lethal. Her training had taught her to feel nothing during these moments, to become a machine that simply executed the mission. In the confusion, Jake made his move. Sarah saw him break free from his captors and tackle one of the guards, fighting for the man's weapon despite his restraints. The other prisoner, showing remarkable courage, helped Jake subdue their guard and began working to free his hands. Sarah continued to provide overwatch, engaging any hostile who threatened Jake or tried to reorganize a defense. Within minutes, the professional force that had seemed so formidable was reduced to scattered survivors trying to escape rather than complete their mission. But the mission wasn't over yet. Sarah could see that some of the hostiles had managed to reach their extraction vehicles and were attempting to leave with at least some of the stolen intelligence. She couldn't allow that information to leave the base, regardless of personal risk. Abandoning her sniper position, Sarah grabbed her gear and began moving toward the communications center. Jake had armed himself and was securing the area, but he would need backup to prevent the remaining hostiles from escaping with classified materials. Sarah reached the communications center just as the last hostile vehicle was leaving the area at high speed. Through the building's windows, she could see Jake helping base communications personnel assess the damage to their systems. He was alive, he was safe, and he was doing his job. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. The escaping vehicle contained intelligence that could compromise American operations worldwide. She still had her rifle, and the vehicle would have to pass through a checkpoint that would provide one final opportunity for engagement. Sarah reached the checkpoint ahead of the escaping vehicle and set up a hasty firing position. When the vehicle appeared, moving at high speed and clearly intending to crash through the gate, she placed her shots with surgical precision. The vehicle lost control and crashed into a concrete barrier, its occupants either killed or stunned by the impact. Base security finally arrived in force just as Sarah was approaching the crashed vehicle to secure any surviving hostiles and recover stolen materials. They found her standing over the wreckage with her rifle, looking like exactly what she was, a soldier who had just completed a successful mission. The base commander arrived on scene within minutes, along with federal investigators and military intelligence personnel. Sarah found herself the center of an investigation that would determine whether she was a hero or a criminal. Her unauthorized entry onto the base, theft of military weapons, and engagement of hostile forces without orders created a complex legal situation. But the evidence spoke for itself. The communications center had been saved, classified intelligence had been recovered, and American personnel had been rescued. Most importantly, a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation had been stopped before it could compromise national security. Jake found her during the debriefing process, pulling her aside for a conversation that was long overdue. He looked at her with new understanding, seeing past the wife he thought he knew to the soldier she had never really stopped being. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Because I wanted to be someone different," Sarah replied. "I wanted to be the person you fell in love with." "Sarah, I fell in love with a soldier, a warrior, the woman who just saved this base and everyone on it. You don't have to hide who you are from me." In the aftermath of the operation, Sarah learned the full scope of what had been planned. The missing family had been approached months earlier by foreign intelligence operatives, posing as researchers interested in the father's work. Their hiking trip had been cover for a meeting that had gone wrong, leading to their capture and the subsequent surveillance operation. The attack on the communications center had been the final phase of a long-term intelligence gathering operation designed to compromise American military communications networks worldwide. If successful, it could have given foreign powers access to classified information for years without detection. Sarah's intervention had stopped the operation and saved lives, but it had also revealed capabilities and knowledge that made her valuable to military intelligence. She was offered a return to active duty with a promotion and assignment to a counterintelligence unit. For the first time in years, someone was asking her to be the soldier she had always been. The decision wasn't easy, but it wasn't really a choice. Sarah had spent 2 years trying to be someone she wasn't, and the experience had taught her that you can't run from who you are meant to be. She accepted the assignment, but with one condition: Jake would be assigned to the same unit, so they could serve together as they had always been meant to do. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell wore the uniform again, but this time with the rank and recognition her skills deserved. She was no longer known as just a Navy SEAL's wife. She was Sergeant Major Sarah Mitchell, and everyone on the base knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The woman who had once hidden her true nature behind a facade of civilian domesticity had learned that some things are too important to hide. Some people are meant to be weapons in defense of others, and there's no shame in accepting that responsibility. Sarah had finally stopped running from herself, and in doing so, she had found a way to be both the soldier she was born to be and the wife Jake deserved. She had learned that strength doesn't come from hiding who you are, but from embracing it completely and using it to protect the things that matter most. The base was safe, her marriage was stronger than ever, and Sarah Mitchell was finally, completely herself.